Thank you. Good evening, everyone. You're all ready for a little lake talk instead of all that river talk? I'm going to talk about the shorelands, in particular looking at what about shorelands makes them resilient to floods, or how could we increase their resilience where they're not. This is a graph we've all seen about 100 times today, but for the few people that weren't here during the day, of course, Lake Champlain flooded to record heights this year, over a foot above its previous record. However, the really remarkable thing about this flood was that the water level stayed above the previous flood level for a month and a half, and it was that prolonged exposure to the high waters and the incidence of a number of heavy storms that really whipped up the waves and pounded the shores while the waters were high that really caused a lot of the extensive damage on the Lake Champlain shore. We've seen through the years, looking at data going back to 1940, that the water level in Lake Champlain is increasing. Certainly there's multiple factors going on here, which I'm not going to really try to explore today, but I think that we can be pretty confident that the water level has increased from an average mean level of about 95.5 feet up to about 97 feet, and the maximum water level has also increased during that same time period. The annual maximum. And we know also from climate change predictions, as well as this chart which shows what's already happened, that the Northeast is really receiving much heavier precipitation storms than previously, bigger events going on. And so again, it was the high water of Lake Champlain combined with the wind and the waves and the long period of time that the water was at that height. I've heard that on some really exposed areas of Lake Champlain, like the southern shore of Isle La Motte, that the waves were coming in 5 or 6 feet above whatever the water level was at that particular time. Now, I don't know if that's just anecdotal information, but it's some areas of the lake certainly got really hammered by the wave action. So myself and other people spent some time, quite a few other people have been looking around the lakeshore at where the damage occurred, and by and large it occurred where people had removed the native woodlands and replaced it with some kind of grass or lawn. In this case, in St. Albans Bay, St. Albans Town Beach, there were some trees there, but it wasn't enough trees, and the soil itself was covered mainly by sod, which is particularly bad at holding soil together when it's under any kind of stress. Again, more pictures of substantial erosion occurring where grass was present as opposed to a mixture of native vegetation. And you can see on the right there that the water topped over some retaining walls and even washed out behind the walls. Certainly there are many reasons why shoreland erosion can occur in addition to high water level and wave action, ice push, groundwater patterns, surface runoff from above can exacerbate the problem. And some of the ways to make the shoreline more resilient will address additional causes of erosion as well. Just a quick look at comparison. In St. Albans, Swanton, this camp faces north on Missisquoi Bay, and you can see the old remnants of their retaining wall, which had actually collapsed and been pushed around before the spring of 2011 flooding, but they lost probably 6 feet of their grass and soil during the storm. But if you turn and look just directly on the other side, an undeveloped piece of shore with a big mixture of trees and shrubs withstood the forces of the high water and the wave action during that period. The tree trunks and the brush stems and so on provide dissipation and absorption of the energy of the waves, and so the pounding on the soil is significantly less. Plus, the diversity of plants provide a much thorough root density and root mass to hold the soil together more thoroughly than something like grass can do. And here's another comparison on the shore of Mallets Bay, some homes that had their banks severely damaged during the high water, and immediately adjacent to that, a wooded bank which withstood the pressures of the high water much better. So I think that it's pretty clear that resilience to flooding can be provided by mimicking the natural shore, either protecting the natural shore if it is as yet undisturbed, but also by designing stabilization measures that seek to reestablish and mimic the conditions that characterize a natural shore. They often have a natural shore often has a row of exposed rock at the water's edge. These pictures are all taken on smaller Vermont lakes, not Lake Champlain, but the same thing on the Lake Champlain shore is much more diverse than it is on many of our smaller lakes. But typically the ice action every year will push and expose rocks right along the shoreline, and then these rocks provide good dissipation of the energy of the waves and send it bouncing in different directions instead of either hitting the shore directly or redirecting it into the neighboring shore. A mix of trees, shrubs, and ground cover, again providing soil stability as well as dissipation of the wave energy. A somewhat sloping bank. In this way, things like the waves or ice that's getting pushed around in the spring can ride up on the shore instead of pushing straight against it. And a lot of our native species that live on lakeshores are very resilient to damage from things like ice or waves because they will bend easily or they will sprout back really easily if they're broken right off. I just wanted to mention really quickly that natural shorelines are also extremely important for water quality protection and habitat values. And many of the in-lake and shoreline habitat values of natural vegetation or a more wooded situation are also going to provide more resilience to the organisms that live in the lake. Organisms in a healthy environment are more able to sustain damage, the stresses of a storm event, as well as adapt to changing conditions such as climate change are bringing our way. Usually, most often, people, if they have an eroding shoreline, immediately think of building a wall, and retaining walls are really a rather poor long-term solution to an erosion problem. Certainly this house on the top here clear-cut the shore to build the house, and then either found that the shoreline started eroding or preemptively built a stone wall. The shore immediately on either side of it is not eroding at all. So it would have been a lot cheaper and provided longer-term stability if these folks had instead just pruned and edited the trees on the shore, made some access, opened up some views through the branches without removing all of the woody vegetation there. But retaining walls tend to transfer the wave energy to adjacent properties. You often get outflanking of the retaining wall where the wall does nothing to dissipate or absorb wave energy, and it just gets bounced down the wall and starts causing erosion on the ends of the wall. And so often a new retaining wall will just beget the need for their neighbors to deal with an erosion problem. They also provide protection from erosion only at certain water levels, as we saw with quite a few retaining walls getting washed out from the backside the walls, as well as the clearing and hard surfacing of a developed property, tend to change the local drainage patterns and can increase the erosion that comes from up above from the developed property, and also, again, maybe disproportionately affecting their neighbor. They're expensive and they require replacement over time, whereas a wooded shore or a vegetated shore can provide its own replacement through time and be a self-sustaining, stable environment. And also, retaining walls, any kind of a vertical surface like that, is something that ice, which has tremendous power, especially on a big lake like Champlain, will just push right against, and ice is very strong and can certainly eventually dismantle a wall, certainly tip it over. There's a lot of ways to revegetate the shoreline. If you are trying to fix an existing erosion problem, the Northwest Regional Planning Commission handbook on shoreline stabilization, which has been mentioned several times today. This is some illustrations from that. It provides a whole host of different stabilization methods and compares them all one to another, what kind of situations they work best in, and what are the relative costs and so on. And that's a very handy tool that the Northwest Regional Planning Commission is now doing a small grant program with that booklet as a basis for landowners that sustained damage during the high waters last year to design a primarily vegetated solution to their situation. I think the value that I helped with some of the workshops that went on in relation to that, and the value of that is not just for the landowners who were interested in alternate stabilization methods, but also I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of bringing along the contractors and the consultants and so on to try to get more people comfortable with designing or installing alternatives to retaining walls. The lower left design is a fiber roll stabilization on a lake out in Minnesota. Instead of using some kind of a rock at the toe of the slope when a stabilization project is done. I don't think we have a lot of experience in Vermont so much with this kind of method on lakeshores, although it's used around the country and the world. So I think that's another, would be a good thing for us to gain more experience with in Vermont. A riprap toe is a way to stabilize a lakeshore that helps to mimic the natural lakeshore, and riprap can become thoroughly vegetated and cover over the rock in a pretty short period of time in terms of integrating it more into the native vegetation. So what does Lakeshore Resilience look like? Well, I think it's a well-vegetated shore with a healthy mix of trees, shrubs, and ground cover that provide root density and mass, a sloped bank, a non-structural bank, less hard armoring for forces like waves and ice to just push and fight against, and certainly buildings and infrastructure above the flood and wave elevations, and protecting floodplain areas, which are equally important on a lakeshore as they are along a river for taking up some of the high waters in areas that won't damage structures. I think there's a lot of research and information needs that we could pursue in the state to further this approach, more detailed mapping and identification of flood-prone areas in the higher elevations, a better understanding of which areas are prone to wind and wave impacts. Lake Champlain's a huge, diverse lake, and these forces are different in all areas of it. And I also think that we do need to have more first-hand experience implementing non-structural stabilization methods and promoting them and working more with the audiences of contractors and landscapers and so on. There are a range of management programs going on right now that affect how shorelines are managed. State, federal, and provincial regulations we've heard about today. Municipal regulations, at least in Vermont, are extremely variable, both in relation to flood insurance, the FIHIP program, as well as the just regular shoreland zoning. There's a lot of education outreach, technical assistance programs going on, and increasingly incentives through grant programs for better management, either by individuals or towns. And I don't think we should forget about shoreline conservation as a means to protect undeveloped shores that are providing both good habitat and protection of the lake habitat, as well as being areas that are can remain more resilient to lakeshore flooding. So that would be conservation easements or purchase of land for protection in a more natural state. I think we should look at the different elevations in Lake Champlain and who's got jurisdiction over work at different elevations in line with what we now know, both about what the mean water level in the lake is, what the annual mean maximum water level is, and also what the new record high water is. The thing I want to point out in particular on this table is that our Vermont state jurisdiction for our shoreline encroachment program, which oversees things like retaining walls built in the lake. Our jurisdiction starts at 95.5 feet and goes lakeward from there. So the vast majority of work that occurs on the shoreline is both in terms of retaining walls and damage is occurring well above that level. In addition, the Army Corps' jurisdiction is at 98 feet, and again, that is well below where even the ordinary, even where the maximum annual mean is. I think I can skip that one. I think there's a need for the education outreach and technical assistance programs to work together more on our message and our materials. It's increasingly hard to get funding for such work under grant programs. More and more grant programs are reluctant to fund more broad-based outreach efforts. And I think we need to, as Yuri suggested in the session this afternoon, really pay attention to the audiences that we're trying to reach and tailor our message for different audiences. This is a quote from the Nature Conservancy's Climate Change in the Champlain Basin report. It says governing agencies on all sides of the lake should work towards consistent, biologically sound shoreline stabilization regulations. And I think that's a really good point for us to pursue. In Vermont, we do have a fairly new surface water management strategy that the division I work in, the Watershed Management Division, developed. We finished it just before the spring 2011 floods, and certainly before Irene, so I think we do and we will be reevaluating the recommendations in there in light of those extreme events. But it does recommend paying attention to some of these same things we've been talking about, building more technical assistance capabilities. Many of the stabilization methods that could be used on Lake Champlain are pretty technical or tricky, and each site is so different, and the forces on the sites are so extreme that I think we do need increasing amounts of technical assistance to advise individuals on how to address problems they may be having. we're moving towards requiring softer stabilization techniques through our own shoreline encroachment program, and the Army Corps of Engineers general permit is up for renewal this year. They're looking at going to a New England general permit, but I think there's an opportunity there to pursue that through that process. And in addition, finally, we were required through the Act 138, or the Rivers and Lakes Bill that was in the legislative session this past year, to look at shorelands and their management and what kinds of changes are needed to better manage the shorelands. And the study requirement specifically requires us to look at statewide regulatory options, which currently in Vermont is not something that we do on a comprehensive basis. So we'll be engaging in that over the summer. I think certainly the flooding experience on Lake Champlain will inform a lot of that study and be very important consideration in the recommendations and options that we lay out in that report. And that's the end.